So I am in my favorite hippie park again, and here's my token face mask, and here's my favorite Hoji Shincha tea. It's really nice bottle of tea. Now, it has been reported that the Suga government didn't like NHK program where he was questioned rather severely. According to international standards, it was nothing. I mean, it was just slight jab, and any politician would have taken it as nothing. But Japan. In Japan, the questions to Prime Minister is always prepared and vetted through the Kisha Club, and actually the bureaucrats write the answers beforehand. So the Prime Minister typically just has to read it, in front of the journalists, and sometimes freelance journalists, if there is one. It's rare that a freelance journalist is given a chance to ask any questions, but if that happens, then the Prime Minister has to answer impromptu. But that is something of a rarity. Now, the NHK program apparently did some vetting of questions. That is always happening because a press officer of the cabinet office is always, it would always do that. That is a protocol. But in normal journalism, typical journalism, in various countries, the journalist would, of course, ignore that. I mean, if the press officer asks the journalist to limit the range of questions, of course the journalists don't respect that. That's the name of the game. I mean, why should you pre-negotiate with the cabinet office and limit the range of questions? That's unthinkable. That's just stupid. But that is a typical daily maneuvers of the Japanese press. So in this particular case, apparently the NHK News 9 presenters did not quite observe this gentleman's agreement. Why should I say rogue's agreement? And for that, the Prime Minister and perhaps more importantly, the cabinet office, press officers at the cabinet office got angry and reprimanded the NHK officials, according to a report published on the web. So, although this is not confirmed, well, things of that nature are never confirmed by either the cabinet office or NHK, but common knowledge would suggest that this is actually what happened more or less prior to and during and after the broadcast of the News 9 program. So I personally think this is pathetic, both on the side of the cabinet office and on the side of NHK. This is not journalism. This is not politics. This is something else. This is what the American people sometimes humorously call the kabuki play, because everything is pre-staged and everything is a matter of formality, and there's no grilling, no hard question, there's no hard talk, and under this cultural atmosphere, the politicians would be pampered by the journalists, and they would be given a red carpet treatment, and the journalists would not do their jobs because they, do not ask what they are by their, the ethics of their profession are required to ask. Checks and balance, and critically appraising the government policies. So this is really a pathetic situation, I think, and the most serious problem of all is that the general public do not know better. They just don't know because ever since, you know, infancy, they are bred in this lukewarm atmosphere. Myself, I was, brought up by watching NHK myself. But fortunately for me, I learned that looking at, for example, political comedies like Yes Minister Beep, the thick of it, in the loop, I learned that actually journalists do not do such a thing as, vetted questions and, pre-agreed protocols and so on. These are things that the journalists do not agree upon. I mean, the journalists can put any question they like, and the Christians are, supposed to answer them. That I learned is the typical business as usual in democracy, and that is not happening here in this country, and that's a minus. There are many wonderful things in this country, but politics and journalism, nobody can boast of, I'm afraid to say.